You're listening to JournoCast with Lewis Thompson.
I think the best place to start, because you're just coming off the back of a flight back from Germany, from the Euros. So talk to me about that whole experience. I know you've covered multiple major tournaments in your career on radio and in broadcasting, but what was it like this time around?
Well, Germany, I'd never been to Germany as a country before, for starters, so it was a brand new experience in many respects, let alone, the football side of things. So that was exciting for me to go to cities that I'd never been anywhere near before in my life. And it's interesting, it was kind of going back to a normal tournament, if any tournament could ever be considered normal, because Qatar 2 years ago was this complete anomaly where everybody was staying in the center of Qatar and staying in the same hotel and just shooting off in different directions, knowing that all the stadia were within 40 minutes of that central base. Obviously, Germany's completely different kettle of fish. It's 7 hours to get from Dortmund to Berlin or whatever it may be. So this involved a lot more hopping about the country, a lot more flying, and trains and things like that, and relying on public transport and things like that. But as a tournament, it was great fun. And the only slight disappointment before we even went is that we were scheduled to, if Wales had made it through the playoffs, that would have been our concentration in the group stages. As it was, Poland beat them. So we ended up watching all three of Poland's group stage games, which were great anyway, because the game against the Netherlands was great fun. Austria was one of the best games I'd covered in the tournament, where Austria came back, and won the game. So that was great. Seeing the hosts in Germany, seeing Georgia beat Portugal was probably the moment of the tournament from my perspective. So, yeah, and a great team to work with. I worked with Darren Bent for the first time as a co-commentator, and he was so brilliantly prepared and so easy to work with. It was a joy.
Yeah, and I wanted to dive in a bit more about the work perspective, and the traveling about and getting to places. Do you enjoy that generally?
Well, when things are on time, everything's so much less stressful. The only slightly, if you can call it stressful, thing was one hotel we were booked to stay in Dortmund was not up to the required standard. And so we had to quickly up sticks and move to another hotel as quickly as we could, because it was clear that the one that we'd had booked for us was all fur coat, no knickers, if that makes any sense. It was, looked very stylish from the outside, but on the inside it was dreadful. So that was slightly stressful, but then, you just roll with it, and you just, you get on with things. But traveling around Germany proved to be pretty straightforward. Getting the train system, I'd heard rumors that the train system in Germany was as bad as it is back here, but no, it was fine. And the internal flights we took using Euro wings mostly were great. Darren's not a great flyer, so he much preferred going on the trains than on the planes. I didn't know that about him, but yeah, he wasn't a fan of that particular aspect of the travel. But I'm easy with that. And you've got time. Once you've landed, once you've got to your hotel room, you've got time to prepare. You're not completely snowed under with, game after game after game, day after day after day. You've got space where you can actually get your work done, and the stress levels don't increase from that perspective. If I compare that to South Africa, when we had a smaller team that went out in 2010 for talkSPORT to that World Cup, I think in the group stages I did something like 15 commentaries in 19 days or something like that. And that was pretty stressful, particularly as it was my first tournament, so I was very green, but I was willing to pitch in, so you just pitched in. But if I compare that to this is a much more relaxed way of getting about a country and getting yourself prepared for the commentaries you have to do.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about South Africa, Ian, in 2010, the World Cup being your first major tournament. What was that experience like as a whole, you know, personally and from a work perspective?
I was so excited. I'd never done a major tournament on site before. The only thing I'd done for talkSPORT was 4 years before, I'd done some off-tube commentaries for the World Cup in Germany. So I hadn't been to Germany, as I said. So I did games from back at home. Did about 4 or 5 of those and did okay. And that was, funnily enough, that tournament, that 2006 tournament was kind of the seed for me getting more work at talkSPORT and becoming more of a main presenter and part of the team. So the South Africa thing, I think I found out I was going as a commentator fairly late on. I knew I was going out there, but I got far more games. I think they had somebody else in mind. I don't know who it is. I still don't know to this day, but I think they had a commentator in mind who their other employer said, no, you can't do that, and pulled them out. So that's why I got that volume of games that I mentioned a little earlier. So that just made it extra daunting. But we all stayed at this lodge just outside Johannesburg in an area called Sandton, and that was our base to fly or drive to various games. So we were right near to Johannesburg, so there were 2 stadiums there. You've also, Cape Town was a flight, Port Elizabeth was a flight, Pretoria you could drive to. What was the other place? Oh goodness, where I saw Japan play. Anyway, you were, you know, it was pretty frantic at times getting to places, but I had good people around me who were able to ease me in, and Jim Proudfoot was the very best at that. We've known each other for a very long time. We were sharing a room in that lodge in Sandton, and he was a massive, massive help to me in terms of just, you know, giving me the lowdown on how these things work. And I ended up staying out. I did a semi-final that year, which I wasn't expecting. I thought I'd be going home after the quarterfinals, but I ended up doing Uruguay against the Netherlands from Cape Town, and then came back before the final. But yeah, it was frantic. It was sometimes a little disorganized, certainly compared to how it is now, the way I perceive it now. But I wouldn't change it. It was a fantastic introduction into tournament football and the responsibilities you have as a broadcaster to paint that picture for everybody back at home.
How did you first feel when you were told that you would be covering the World Cup in South Africa? Because having done a bit more research in your career, Ian, it seems to me like that sort of thing wouldn't faze you. But did that make you nervous? And do you still get nervous?
Oh, of course you get nervous. Of course you get nervous. You wouldn't be human if the adrenaline didn't kick in at some point. How did I feel? I was bricking it, I think. Yeah, I think I was not terrified, but I was certainly thinking, don't screw this up. This is a real opportunity for you to showcase what you think you can do as a commentator, you know, showcase your abilities, show the bosses how good you think you are and prove it to them. So whilst there was a degree of trepidation, there was also some determination about, okay, they've picked me. I'm going to show why they've picked me. So, yeah, a few nerves, but once the first couple of games were under my belt, I'm sure I relaxed and, you know, got into that rigmarole of prep game, that sort of thing. It was no different to being back at home in that sense, but you're just going to wildly different stadiums.
Yeah, you essentially wanted to prove yourself being in South Africa. And how
It's all I've ever done. It's all I've ever done.
Doing that?
It's all I've ever done, trying to prove myself, because I don't have an agent. I've never had an agent as a radio broadcaster. So from the time I came into broadcasting at the age of, 29, 30, and I'm 55 now, I feel as though I've had to prove myself a little bit more, because I haven't gone down the orthodox route of getting into radio that so many people of my era did, whether that was, getting into hospital radio as a teenager, or doing work experience at a radio station whilst they were at college, and by the time they were in their early 20s, they'd either gone in there as a full-time employee or they'd moved on somewhere else. So I had a wildly different career path to that. Up to the age of 29, I was a guitar salesman, wannabe rock star, and I enjoyed that life, and then purely by accident that the radio career fell into my lap, and that's far too long a story to go into here. But yeah, you feel as though you're having to prove yourself all the time, because you feel fortunate, and I still feel fortunate with every game that I get to go to. I feel like all right, you've got to prove yourself again, that it's absolutely right that they've given you this game, and that's been the case since day one at talkSPORT, really.
And do you think that stems from, because I do want to briefly discuss your career in music, and do you think that stems from being into music at such an early age, and in a sense almost having to prove yourself there as well, because you mentioned, wannabe rock star, and then that transition into broadcasting? Is that something you've constantly felt a presence in your life?
Well, let's see. I've never really seen the Venn diagram of the musical career and the radio career sort of intersecting that much, because they are wildly different worlds. I mean, I've got a lot of self-belief, and you have to have a certain degree of self-belief if you think you're going to be a success as a musician, radio presenter, biochemist, anything. It doesn't matter what your career path is. So you have to have that belief in yourself ahead of anything else.
Where do you think that comes from?
Well, if you know you're good at something, if you know intrinsically that you have a skill, and you work at that skill and you get better at it, then that's not arrogance. That's not being conceited. That's just knowing that you've got a skill set within you that you can make work for you. And it just so happens that in my life, I've been able to use very different skill sets in very different paths, whether it be as a musician come salesman, which you can look at for, 10 years of my life working in Birmingham, or as a broadcaster, which in itself involved a number of offshoots, which I'm sure you know about, and a completely different skill set required for that. So I'm not sure whether one informs the other. I think I spoke about this on my podcast once with a couple of guys. I did an episode with Commentator's Curse, it's called, and Adam Blackmore from BBC Solent and my talkSPORT colleague Mark Wilson were on with me. And we were all in the same boat in that we'd all come into broadcasting late. And you talk about life experience, and I think those years at the University of Life that I had in my 20s, actually, it's just being in that environment of I wasn't earning a great deal of money. Working as a guitar salesman's, pretty much you're living hand to mouth. You're not broke, but there's usually too much month left at the end of the money. But that just gave me a good life perspective, I think, and an appreciation of earning what you earn and deserving what you earn, I think. So maybe that aspect informed what came afterwards with the broadcasting career.
Yeah, and Ian, I find your transition into broadcasting incredibly fascinating, because, as you said yourself, not many people go through that route into the industry. Because obviously, as you said yourself, wannabe rock star, it wasn't always the plan to end up in broadcasting on radio at talkSPORT. And the one thing I love to hear from people is when they found that moment of this is what I want to do. And for some people, it comes later than others. When I spoke to Gary Taphouse, he knew from a very young age that commentary is what he wanted to do. But when did you find that moment and think, this is it and really go for it?
Well, I love sport and I love football, so I always had an appreciation for commentators when I was a little lad and I was growing up. So I had, even though I didn't, I loved people like Barry Davies and David Coleman and Hugh Johns, who were very well-known football commentators in the 70s from when I was growing up. And when I went to sixth form college in Solihull, there was a media course that I went on, and we had a college radio station I presented on. And Radio 4 came to do a Radio 4 for Schools broadcast. So this is back in 1987 or something like that. Terry Christian was the host, and I was his co-host. And, we hit it off, and we did a pretty good show. I then wrote to the producer that I'd met that day, and she wrote back saying, well, if you haven't got a degree, forget it. And I had no desire to go to university at all at that point, because I had this fixation, the delusions of grandeur about being a successful musician. So I didn't make that necessary connection. But that will probably help you understand that germ, that seed of interest in broadcasting was always there, but it just wasn't at the surface for an awfully long time. So I went into working in shops, like the guitar shop that I mentioned. And basically what happened was, so we're going back to 1997 here. So I would have been in my late 20s. My best friend, he's still my best mate now, and he never lets me forget it, Keith. He wrote a letter to Tom Ross, who's the head of sport, well, at that time was the head of sport at BRMB Radio in Birmingham, the second biggest commercial radio station in the country, saying, essentially, my mate Ian does impressions of all these football managers down the pub, and we think he's wasted. He should be on the radio. Because down the pub, I was doing my Trevor Francis impression or Graham Taylor. And it's all football related, so the football love was there, And something in that letter that Keith sent piqued Tom's interest. And so he rang me. I still remember the phone call. I was dusting the guitar counter down one day, and the tannoy said, call for Ian down to line 4, it's Tom Ross. And I thought, this is Keith just taking the piss. Because I didn't know he'd written the letter. This is Keith taking the piss. And I picked up the phone, and Keith was crap at impressions, so I knew it wasn't him. It really was Tom. And it developed into writing sketches for Capital Gold, BRMB. And then my first job in radio was the Flying Eye, the Eye in the Sky travel reporter. And I got that job in February of 1998. And that was the moment when I was offered that job. I'd been asked to come into the office, and I thought Tom was calling me into the office to, gently nudge me out and say, can't use you anymore. But he actually took me into the office of the BRMB program controller, who, within 5 minutes of me sitting down in his chair, offered me the Flying Eye job. And something clicked at that moment, because whilst I've been doing these sketches, I was still working. Actually, I was a guitar distributor by that time. I was distributing guitars to shops and not really enjoying it. And when that offer came, there was just a moment. I've got to say yes. Because if I don't say yes, he's going to offer that job to somebody else 5 minutes from now. And B, how can you turn down an opportunity like this? The sky's the limit, if no pun intended, going up, in a plane. And so that was it. I said yes instinctively. Went back to the factory or the warehouse I was working in, and I rang my mum and dad and said, "This is what I've just done. What do you think?" And they both said, "No, that sounds, you're not happy where you are. This does sound like a really good opportunity. Grasp it." And so within 2 weeks, I left my job as a guitar distributor, and I was starting my broadcasting career in earnest up in a plane 1,500 feet above Birmingham city centre.
And your drive to succeed must have been at an all-time high at that point when you were first offered that job. Did it almost feel like you were leaving the music industry behind and starting a new chapter, or?
Kind of, because having reached the age of 29, as I was then, and despite my best efforts and the best efforts of my musical pals around me, nothing has really materialized in terms of anything, in terms of a record deal or anything progress that meant, okay, this could become a professional career. So I'd probably had that moment of clarity, certainly about playing original music of my own. And I was playing in a couple of cover bands by that time. So my musical ambitions they'd sort of gone down a little bit. I was being a bit more realistic about, let's just have some fun with the music and things like that. So the arrival of the broadcasting career didn't affect the musical side of things at all, because I'd already consciously made that decision. I'm not going to make it. And every musician who doesn't make it will tell you they know kind of instinctively when that moment is, when, okay, that ship has sailed. So that wasn't a problem. That wasn't a problem at all.
Growing up in your 20s, Ian, from my experiences anyway, in the early stages of my journalism career, I mean, I'm 22 now, but I think there would be some sort of similarities in a sense, and I'm talking about music and journalism here, in a sense of the graft and the persistence and, the free work that you have to put in to eventually start earning that money and making a name for yourself in both respective industries.
Yeah.
I find it incredible. What was it like in your early 20s, trying to break through, when you're 21, 22, 23, and what were some of the challenges you were facing during that time?
I was in a band called Shotgun Wedding. We were a sort of Aerosmith, Guns N' Roses, sleazy sort of rock band in Birmingham, and there were a dozen bands, either a little bit or a lot like us at that time, all vying to be top dog in Birmingham. And then from there, you conquer the rest of the country, try and get a record deal, a publishing deal, tour supports, that sort of thing. But we rehearsed a lot as a band. We rehearsed 4 nights a week. We rehearsed Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sunday afternoons. We were very dedicated as a band to improving. And I have a natural ear for music. I found out when I was 10 or 11 that I had perfect pitch. So I became a songwriter because I learned how to play piano. Piano came before drums, which is my main instrument. And then I learned to play guitar by the time I was working in guitar shops. So I became quite multifaceted. So I had a lot of confidence in myself as a songwriter. I'd bring the songs that I'd come up with to the band. They'd love them and they'd want to work on them. So I gained confidence from that, knowing that other people who, could just as easily have dismissed what I come up with, go, no, we want to work on that. So that gave me a lot of self-confidence in my own abilities. And it was 10 years of ultimately a failure, but the journey to fail was not miserable. It was great fun at times. Yeah, you're stuck in a transit van, traveling up and down the country to play to, 2 men, a dog, and a can of beans at some pub in Nowheresville. But that's paying your dues, isn't it? That's the phrase that keeps coming up in any career, any walk of life. You pay your dues. It doesn't just get handed to you for you to have it on a plate. You have to earn it. So, in the bands I was in, and Shotgun Wedding was one of 2 bands I was in, playing original music in my 20s. The other one, Sons of God, certainly got closer to getting onto a certain rung of the ladder. But again, it just fell short. But again, the dedication was there. My abilities as a songwriter, as a musician, as a drummer, as a singer improved. month on month, year on year. So I had that confidence to say to myself, right, when I get behind that drum kit and I'm playing this music, I don't think there's many people who could do a better job than me at this. And that's kind of what you try and say to yourself as a broadcaster. Who else is going to get onto this microphone and describe this game and do it better than me? I don't want to have that feeling that there's lots of people out there that can do better than me. Yeah, there are people that can, a handful, but you've got to have that self-belief that when that microphone switched on and you're live, you're prepared, you're knowledgeable, you're a good communicator, and there's not many people out there that can do that better than you.
Is there anything you would say to yourself that you know now that you didn't know back then that would have helped you?
Not really. No. I've been asked this a few times, and I can't pretend to, want to wag the finger at the 24-year-old Ian and say you should have done this, you should have done that. No, I tend not to think of life that way. I think being in that band, or the bands I was in, taught me a lot about life anyway, even if they ultimately weren't successful. I think they were an important stepping stone in many ways because of the people I met, the people I worked with, the people you associated with. So, no, certainly no desire to go back, and I wouldn't change anything, not for a moment. It was a terrific time.
So what did you learn from that stage of your life that you've been able to carry in to your broadcasting career and to this day?
Well, the work ethic is definitely top of that tree. Whether you're working to get better at playing your chosen musical instrument, or trying to get better as a songwriter or a singer or a performer, because there's a visual aspect to being in a rock band and trying to look good and perform well and project yourself. So, you learn a lot about that, but you learn a lot about social interaction, and you learn a lot about how to be the right person. You learn how to be sociable. You learn how to be a better person, and to have time for people, because working in the guitar shop was probably as important as anything else, because I was meeting customers every day who were kind of like-minded souls. They were musicians, and you'd chat to them, you'd break bread with them. Sometimes you meet people that were pretty well known, and that was pleasant when those things happened, when you met the sort of the rock stars of the day who'd come in. But generally, it was just about developing what turned out to be a massive social circle of people who you got on with, and you had a sort of a kindred spirit kind of feeling with, because some of them, to one degree or another, were trying to do the same thing that you were trying to do. So just that social aspect of, in my 20s, of building the friendships and the associations that I did, was a really nice bedrock from which to work, and become a broadcaster and develop a whole new sort of social circle of friends that I have to this day. And, I've still been able to maintain both. There's still the friendships I have from the musical side of things, and the friendships that I've developed on the broadcasting side of things.
You mentioned social interaction there, and I wanted to get your thoughts on the industry as a whole in 2024 these days, because obviously, without stating the obvious, when you were 22 compared to me now, the differences in life and communication and everything in that regard is completely different. How do you find working and operating in this industry in 2024 compared to 10, 15 years ago?
Well, the industry, the radio, if you look at radio itself, the radio industry has contracted and has got very much smaller. Independent local radio has become so homogenized. The sort of individual independent local radio stations are becoming fewer and further between, because Heart is buying up stations. greatest hits radios buying up stations. So, that sort of banner means that there's, BRMB's disappeared. For example, the station I worked at, which was the second biggest in the country. But whilst the radio industry has contracted and got smaller and smaller with everybody buying everybody else, the opportunities that come people's way online, YouTubers, watch-alongs, club video, because clubs have their own TV channels, don't they, with their own content. So the opportunities are there from a very different regard to get a foothold in the industry. It depends what people's ultimate ambition is, whether people see radio as an ultimate ambition. I sense that isn't necessarily the case anymore. I think people see YouTube and they see, watch-alongs and individual club television stations as being a more attractive proposition. And that's fine. That's a generational thing. Radio is still vitally important. I think it is. But you could tell me different as a 22-year-old. But I think radio is still a very important thing for people to listen to, and it always will be. But whilst the opportunities have lessened in that area, opportunities are quite plentiful in others. But I don't know how financially rewarding those opportunities are, because I'm not party to that. I don't know whether that's a good place to go and try and develop, or whether there's just no remuneration that makes it a worthwhile path to stay on and sort of try and sort of trundle along and then look for something else further up the tree.
Yeah, I agree. I believe there still is a very strong audience for radio out there, because I think it's hard to, you get so many people making podcasts these days and other forms of content. I think it's very difficult to replicate that kind of professionalism and the people that you can get in the industry on radio. I think that's a very hard thing to try and remake almost. Ian, what are your thoughts on social media itself?
An occupational hazard, because it would be very difficult to not have it, in the sense that but then, I joined Facebook not because I was on radio, because I just wanted to connect with mates who I maybe hadn't seen for a while, and that's still the case with a site like that. Twitter, when I joined that, was more of a way to promote what my radio station was doing, what game I was doing, to try and get people to tune in, and that's pretty much the way it's always been. But the abuse is always there. I don't get anything like the amount of abuse that others get, but it still comes my way now and again, and I've long since learned to disregard that sort of aspect of it, because these are people you are never ever going to meet in your life, never. So why get hung up on them? I might be telling you different if I was getting the sort of levels of abuse that some of my colleagues get, but they're much more front and center. And see, my job as a commentator isn't to be opinionated, whereas those who host programs, and I still host programs now and again, but not as often as I used to, but it's the hosting of programs and proffering that opinion that invites the abuse much more. As a commentator, you're just saying what's happening on the pitch in front of you. So people can dislike you, they can dislike your commentary style, and they'll tell you so, but ultimately that's not a dislike based on your opinion. That's a dislike based on they don't like the sound of your voice or the way that you describe things. So social media, it's there. It's the genie's out of the bottle, isn't it? It's never going to be back in a more sedate form. Yeah. So you just have to get on with it.
I think that's a brilliant way to look at it. And I was speaking to Peter Jury last week, and he said the very similar thing of, you're never going to meet these people. So at the end of the day, what's the point looking at that kind of thing? Ian, I just wanted to wrap up here. We've got about 3 minutes left. I just wanted to wrap up with a few quick-fire questions based on
Okay.
your career as a broadcaster, and
Okay.
mostly on football, essentially. So, what's the best player you've ever seen? Who is, sorry, the best player you've ever seen?
Best player. Well, I saw Trevor Francis when I was a boy, and he was my first footballing hero. So I'd have to start with him because he was an extraordinary talent. And a Trevor Francis playing now on the pitches that we have now compared to the rutted peat bogs that we had back in the 1970s that masqueraded as football pitches, he would be, what a superstar, because he was quick, he was agile, brilliant at scoring goals and setting other. He was just the complete player. Andres Iniesta is a player that always springs to mind at times like this. I think he was just a glorious footballer, who so unselfish. It's a brilliant player to watch as part of that Spanish team. So Francis, Iniesta, there's Glenn Hoddle, there's Michel Platini when he was a player. There's, Maradona, obviously, but I never got to see those guys really live.
And what about favorite stadium you've commentated at?
I always wanted to go to the Stade Velodrome in Marseille after Dennis Bergkamp scored one of the best goals ever at World Cup in '98 when the Netherlands beat Argentina. And I got to work there in Euro 2016 when Portugal played Poland. That was a really nice moment. And having just come back from Germany, I have to say going to the Olympiastadion in Berlin was a pretty eye-opening moment. That's a stadium that's dripping with history, with Jesse Owens and the 1936 Olympic Games and Hitler and all that. So you could feel that history, within that stadium. So that was a pretty special place to go and visit too.
And favorite sporting moment?
Birmingham City winning the League Cup in 2011. It's still my favorite joke of all time. A Frenchman walks into a pole and Birmingham City win the League Cup because Koscielny collided with Szczesny and we end up winning the match. You can't top that. You cannot top that.
I mean, perfect. Ian, that's a great way to wrap up. And just very lastly, 5 words of advice that you would give to anyone trying to break into any industry in life.
Can I give you 6?
You can.
Fail to prepare, prepare to fail.